Okay. Um, Welcome to everybody for the launch of guidelines prepared by One Family in relation to human rights, equality, and one-parent families. My name is Donna McGowan. I'm a board member of One Family. I'm also a practicing solicitor specializing in the area of family law. Just to note, firstly, in terms of housekeeping, that this session is being recorded, although obviously the only people who will show up will be the speakers and myself as chair. So again, welcome to all attendees. We're here today, attendees today from a range of government departments, colleges, voluntary sector organisations, as well as people parenting alone, shared parenting of their children. And also we have some elected representatives. We've approximately 100 people here today to view this event. And then we know that many more will be able to watch it on our YouTube channel. I'm delighted to be able to present these guidelines, which is a hugely important topic of human rights and equality issues for one-parent families. We know from research which this organisation and others have done over 50 years and more that people living in one-parent families, that the children and those parents living in those families face really a wide range of challenges and barriers. They typically experience poor living conditions than many others. So really understanding the needs of one-parent families is really very vital. We know that due to personal issues, challenges that may be associated with relationship breakdown, to separation, family law courts, maintenance issues, all these issues play upon and feed into difficulties experienced by one families. But all of these issues interact with laws, policies and services that make things even harder for those individuals. And we really need to develop an understanding of the needs of one parents in terms of trying to address these concerns. While we all know that great progress has been made over society in the last 50 years, there are still huge issues facing, for example, pregnant women that exist even from 50 years ago. Those problems include nowhere to live, unable to work because of childcare problems, much lower income, judgment from society, violence and abuse. We know that great strides have been made, many positive things have happened, but we still need to address and continue to fight for the needs of one-parent families. And we need to address, in particular, institutional inequalities and discrimination, which still very much still affect one-parent families. It seems to me that if you look at the development of human rights over the last years, it was always viewed, development of human rights was always seen as a burden on the state, placing financial obligations on the state, and we had to fight for human rights through the courts, through activism. Really, I think what's required is a cultural change to not view human rights as a burden on the state or anybody else, but in fact, really, what essentially are human rights? I mean, essentially, human rights is about really setting minimum standards for the treatment of individuals, for other persons. And how do we know, how can we understand the needs of other individuals without understanding those individuals themselves? So really, it's about educating people, allowing people to express themselves, giving people the dignity, space and respect when they interact with state organizations, so that then we can fully understand the needs of people. The development of these guidelines is very much in keeping with that. We greatly appreciate the former president, the president of One Family, former President Mary Robinson, for her support, wisdom, and words in terms of the forward to the guidelines. We have a great panel of speakers today, so we're going to run through the speakers, and then we will have a Q&A session at the end at about 12:30. You can also use hashtag OPF Rights if you would like to share your thoughts about this event on social media, and send in your questions for the panel during the presentation using the Q&A button. So I'll proceed now just to introduce the first speaker. So I'm delighted to welcome the Chief Commissioner of IREC, Sinéad Gibney, who is going to do the official launch of these guidelines. Sinead is a former board chair and board member of One Family, and her governance legacy is still felt by the current board. We appreciate the grant also received from IREC to undertake the development of these guidelines, and we believe that they will fill an important piece for the human rights and equality landscape. So welcome to Sinead.
Many thanks, Donna, for a lovely introduction, and to the One Family team for the invitation to speak today. As Donna has just said, and as many of you will know, One Family is an organisation which is dear to my own heart, not just as a lone parent who has looked to their work and advocacy in my own life, but also as someone who has formerly served on the One Family board. And I've seen firsthand through that the devotion and commitment of your staff and advocates. It's a pleasure, therefore, as Chief Commissioner of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, to be here today and to see your continued success and your work developing and thriving, supporting people parenting alone, people sharing parenting, and Ireland's diverse range of family forms. I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes, starting with what jumped out at me from the guides themselves that we're here to launch today. I'm then going to cover the public sector equality and human rights duty, some samples of our work in IREC that relate to one-parent families, and I'll finish with an extract from a recent Supreme Court judgment that dealt with the constitutional protection or lack thereof for those families in Ireland which don't include a marriage. The question being asked today is a seemingly simple one. How can organisations prevent discrimination against one-parent families who access their services? Preventing discrimination, rather than reacting to remediate or resolve after harm has been done, is the golden thread which as a commission we are seeking to weave through all of the services provided by public bodies here in Ireland. Indeed, it's so important to us that we've made it one of our 5 strategic priorities. Too often we read in the paper about a discrimination case taken and its outcome in terms of a ruling and possible monetary or other reward. But the point often missed is the enduring impact on that person's life, on their confidence, on their career, and on their health, including their mental health, which can continue long after the case has disappeared from the headlines. That's why we're proud, through our Human Rights and Equality Grant Scheme, to support One Family's work on this project and to formally launch these guides today, which aim to prevent such discrimination from happening. There are 2 guides, one focused on helping and supporting parents and members of one-parent families, and the other aimed at helping and supporting civil servants in the delivery of their work. Through both of these guides, the themes of dignity, respect, and the positive power of simply being treated equally shine through in the voices of those people who gave of their experience to make this work come to life. Crucially, the guides create a real-world bridge between the problems and barriers that members of one-parent families have experienced in accessing and using public services and the policy solutions required to overcome such barriers. The guides bring home not just the ability of negative interactions to cause damage and upset, they also reaffirm from people's personal experiences the power of positive interactions to really make someone's life tangibly better. I was struck by one quote from a parent in the guide who spoke about their engagement with a public service after having a good interaction with someone. I felt they valued me as who I am, reminded me that I am not alone. I know my worth, and it built resilience moving forward. It's also important that these guides highlight the need to ensure awareness of and responsiveness to intersectionality. People in one-parent families may and often do belong to another group protected by equality law, putting that person at risk of additional disadvantage. One-parent families may include people with disabilities, members of the LGBTQ+ community, migrants, ethnic minorities, or members of the travelling community. The public sector equality and human rights duty is at the core of these guides published today. Some of you may not have heard of it, but the idea is a simple and a powerful one. It is much better to avert discrimination and harm being done by being proactive as public services. Ireland's law since 2014 has set in place this statutory obligation to ensure that all public bodies in Ireland have responsibility to promote equality, prevent discrimination, and protect the human rights of their employees, customers, service users, and everyone affected by their policies and plans. Tomorrow, I'll be at the Oireachtas holding a dedicated briefing for TDs and senators on the public sector duty to ensure that they can also use it as a tool in working with public bodies. It is the state's responsibility to respect, protect and fulfill human rights in line with its international commitments and to be proactive in ensuring that all public bodies are human rights and equality compliant. The duty as a catalyst for institutional reform can play a significant role here. It can improve public services, addressing issues such as accessibility so that they meet the needs of everyone who requires them. The duty provides an important framework to systematically consider and reflect the particular needs of staff and service users at risk of inequality and discrimination. It can help to mitigate and avoid unintended consequences, such as when a decision made in good faith can end up having a disproportionate impact on a particular group or excluding them altogether from a service. It puts equality and human rights into the mainstream of how public bodies carry out their daily work. The duty sits within Ireland's equality law framework, and this year Minister O'Gorman has committed to a review of equality law here in Ireland. We in IREC see this as a significant opportunity to strengthen equality law and bring it to a point where discrimination is primarily prevented rather than dealt with after the fact when it's already caused harm. We have, since our inception, been aware and active on the need to combat discrimination against people in one-parent families. Recent work, for example, using our legal powers, saw us represent a mother of two from sub-Saharan Africa. Despite being granted permission to remain, she was blocked from accessing the single-parent family payment, and because of that decision, had to drop out of a pre-nursing course. With our help, she challenged it to the Social Welfare Appeals Office and secured the payment in a case which will also help others in similar situations. This is just one example. We've also used our legal powers in cases involving a father accessing housing support to provide a home for his children, in immigration, citizenship and wardship cases where being in a one-parent or unmarried family was a factor in the case. Using our research powers, we published in the last year our new research with the ESRI entitled Monitoring Adequate Housing in Ireland. This showed that lone parents and their children account for 53% of all homeless families and are much more likely to experience poor housing than other household types. It also showed in relation to housing that less than 25% of lone parents reported home ownership compared with 70% of the total population. Lone parents had higher rates of affordability issues at 19% when compared to the general population at 5%. And were particularly vulnerable to housing quality problems such as damp and lack of central heating at 32% compared to 22%. Work in support of the rights of one-parent families takes on even further importance as we look into the winter and our escalating cost of living crisis. The Society of St. Vincent de Paul last month reported how it received on average 30 calls an hour from parents who are unable to afford the costs of sending their children back to school this year. They went on to say that almost half of those requests came from one-parent families, which they said reflected the very high levels of poverty experienced among these families. In this context, and the pressures we're facing this autumn, winter and beyond, we will likely see more people in one-parent families than ever before engaging in ever-growing ways with our public services. Fundamentally, what we see is that people from one-parent families continue to face discrimination. This speaks not just to interactions with our public services, but also to a wider cultural and societal narrative under which the state operates. Just under 22 years ago, I became a single mum. I come from a privileged background, and the state supports at that time were relatively good, sadly, much better than they are today. But nonetheless, raising my daughter was a struggle. When I interacted with state services in my day-to-day life, I was routinely assumed to be married, expected to have a husband, and reminded constantly that our family did not take the shape that was valued by society. My daughter grew up answering for a parent who wasn't there because, again, it was assumed that her dad was here and active in her life. Like any family, we had our ups and downs, but it is in spite of, not because of, the norms that surrounded us, that we were able to remain sure in ourselves that our family was one of dignity, value, and importance in this society. At the end of 2020 and into last year, IREC was involved as a friend of the court in a really difficult Supreme Court case, which focused on the medical treatment of an 11-year-old boy, JJ, who suffered life-changing neurological injuries in an accident. In our legal submissions, we argued that any decision in respect of John's treatment had to be made in a manner that balanced and protected his constitutional rights as a child, with due regard to the rights of his devoted unmarried parents. Among the issues dealt with in this Supreme Court case were the care of JJ and the primary protection of a child's rights within the family. In a separate judgment delivered by the now retired Mr. Justice McKechnie, he directly addressed Article 41 rights and the non-marital family. And in wording that really has stuck in my head since then, he set out in paragraph 157, notwithstanding these observations made as recently as a few years ago, the fact remains that whatever about when the Constitution was drafted, the supposition that getting married is the sole trigger for whether or not a unit grouping is recognised as a family seems increasingly divorced from the social and cultural realities of a great many people in Ireland, a view shared even by many committed to marriage. There is now a great diversity of family structures, increasing in number, that fulfill the functions once thought to be reserved to that traditional marital model. The proliferation of unmarried cohabiting couples, same-sex couples, married or unmarried, separated and divorced couples, and couples each of whom were married previously, to name but a few, cannot have been envisaged by the drafters of the Constitution, nor could they imagine that in accordance with the 2016 consensus, there was more than 150,000 cohabiting couples in Ireland, meaning two adults living in a long-term committed relationship, sharing expenses, etc., and many with children. And whilst this increasing group of non-marital families have not hitherto found express protection within the four walls of the Constitution, one might very well wonder why, if these groupings, sometimes constituting de facto families, fulfill the same societal functions as the marital family, they are considered any less worthy of the protections afforded by the family rights provisions of Article 41, end quote. I urge you to read that full judgment, which you can find at courts.ie. Because as well as seeking to ensure that the state's public services are blind to different kinds of families in their delivery and respect to all, we must also ensure that our state's constitution is updated to reflect our lived experience and that of all those who contributed to these guides. I'm delighted again on behalf of the Commission to launch today these new evidence-based guidelines, one for parents and one for the public sector. This work moves us further towards a day when equality doesn't have to be enforced, but instead is avoided, and instead where discrimination is avoided before it happens. Thank you.
Sinead, many thanks for those words. I'm really struck by the notion of prevention, not reacting to discrimination, to really understand where discrimination can arise and to build in, as you say, into the mainstream policies and practices which prevent that. I think that's really, really so powerful. Just to say that again, that we'll have questions that can be directed to Sinead and the other speakers at the end. As we're running slightly over, I'm just going to move quickly along now. I'm going to introduce Niamh Kelly, who's our next speaker. Niamh is the policy manager of One Family, and she's going to give an overview of the research and the guidelines.
Thanks, Donna. I'm just going to share my screen. Bear with me. Okay, so I hope everyone can see that. Well, listen, it's great to have everyone here today. We're delighted so many people from public bodies could make it. We've got a real range of public bodies in attendance today and represented. I'm particularly happy to recognise some of the names coming up from our research. So I know some of the parents who took part in the research and were members of our rights holders steering group are here with us today, and I just want to extend a really warm welcome to them. So just to give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about today, I'll give you a background to the research, our aims and objectives, an overview of the methodology and the findings. And I really want to focus in on the voices of parents, because that's really at the core of what we were trying to do with the research and what we've tried to present and aim to present in our guidelines. And I'm then going to just talk you through what's in the guidelines and give you kind of, again, just a broad overview of what you can find in there. And they're available now to download. And I know that they've been shared in the chat function there as well. So everyone can take a look at those. And then at the end, I'll just cover some kind of key learning and questions that have arisen. So our background and aims and objectives. In 2006, One Family first published the Human Rights and One Parent Families Guide. At that time, the guideline was really focused and aimed at people who are working on behalf of one parent families, and it was very much looking at human rights. Since then, there's been a lot of developments in equality legislation, and I think I suppose one of the inspiration for us in doing this project was that we are celebrating 50 years this year of One Family. So it's our 50th birthday. And we looked to our vision, which is that an Ireland where every family is cherished equally and is enabled to enjoy the social, financial, and legal equality to create their own positive futures. So in looking back to the original guide, we rethought it and really wanted to focus in on the voices of rights holders, what their experiences were, and make a book, a publication that was useful to them, but that also really centered them, and they were involved in the development of it. And then the other side of it is the public sector equality and human rights duty. And we were inspired by the duty and the obligations that are contained within the duty and how they could be used to better improve and to ensure that one-parent families have a good experience when accessing public services. So our methodology in autumn 2021, we commissioned research which contained an online survey which ran over the autumn. And then we also had, at the same time, we ran some focus groups. So there were 3 focus groups of parents, and the focus groups covered off the same topics and the same questions as the online survey so that they were comparable, but it gave participants an opportunity to expand on their experience and tell us really, in detail their views. So then the participants of the focus group were invited to take part in a rights holder steering group. And the Rights Holder Steering Group met during the spring of 2022. And the purpose of that was to advise us on the content of the guidelines, to give us feedback on the findings that we shared with them, and to really support the development of the guidelines and make sure that the parent voice was really present and strong in those guidelines. Okay, so an overview of the research. We had 148 parents who took part. 17 parents took part in the focus groups. There were 3 focus groups in total, and they were online due to COVID restrictions. Around 80% were mothers, 18% were fathers, and 2% preferred not to say. We had 73% of parents who took part describe themselves as parenting alone, and 27% then said that they were sharing parenting. So here's one of the questions that we asked, just was about what public services have you engaged with over the last year? So participants, as you can see there, social protection, the Department of Social Protection Services came out as the kind of top engaged with service. And you can see there the other ones that came up quite high. We then also asked about their most frequently engaged with service, their second most frequently engaged with service, and their third most frequently engaged with service. So again, social protection, family law come out quite high. Family law dropped down considerably in the second and third most frequent, and conversely, the health services jumped up to around 27–30% of parents indicating that they were the most frequent. So it was just to give us a snapshot of where parents were engaging. Some other services that came up were TUSLA, the Child and Family Agency, Garda Síochána, the Office of the Revenue Commissioners. So of all the range of different public services that one-parent families engage with, some came up that weren't subject to the public sector duty, but we've included comments about those just to give a fulsome view of which services parents are engaging with. Not all public bodies the parents said they were engaging with have published their public sector action plan on their website. So some are still yet to do that. So that's something that we were monitoring as well. So some key themes that came up. Participants were asked about their experiences when interacting with public services. So they were asked about positive and negative experiences. And that was a central pillar of the research, is that we wanted to hear about the good as well as the things that weren't going so well. And we really wanted to learn from both. So dignity and respect, the values that are, run throughout human rights came up quite strongly. So the values were key in how parents described both positive and negative interactions. It was also, they were central in how parents believed they should be treated by public bodies. Protection from harassment. Parents described experiencing degrading, humiliating, intimidating, or offensive treatment, which undermined their dignity during some of their interactions. Discrimination based on civil or family status. And parents described a range of interactions in which they felt discriminated against because of family type, and also discrimination based on gender. And as Sinead mentioned earlier, intersectionality was another theme that came up, where parents described feeling discriminated against because of their family status, as well as another equality ground. One thing that was very strong was the desire to be understood. So parents, reported that they felt that their family was othered or stigmatized, and that they weren't valued, they were viewed as lesser than. And they really strongly wanted to have their say on the services that they use, and to make sure that, public bodies are listening to them. So in terms of the positive experiences, 50% of respondents had a positive experience, and some of the public bodies that were singled out included the Department of Social Protection, particularly case officers, community welfare officers and intro officers, the Office of the Revenue Commissioners, education bodies, particularly primary schools and teachers, the Free Legal Aid Service, Money Advice and Budgeting Service, and members of the legal profession and NGOs also came up quite positively. So the impact then of positive interactions, parents reported that a positive interaction with a public body could really bolster their mental health and their feelings of self-worth. They reduced stress, they supported their parenting. And, for some parents, their feedback were really around practical things that their interaction had meant for their family. So, for example, parents described exiting homelessness as a result of having a positive experience. Another parent described how her family had got heating in their house because of their positive experience. So a really practical sense in the lived experiences of families, it can make a massive difference. And a core theme, and something that's really, I can't stress enough how important it was, and how much parents really felt that engaging positively with public bodies meant they continued to engage with that public body, but not only that, they would engage with other public bodies, and they were encouraged, and their confidence was built in engaging with public services. So some of the quotes there from parents, they felt valued, they felt that they weren't alone, and it built their resilience. Parents described feeling more energized and being able to engage with their child, not being afraid to ask for help in future. And that was a really key theme that came across when people are talking about that experience they had that meant the difference to them, that they wouldn't be frightened to ask for help again. And I think the quote at the bottom here is really powerful. The impact of that experience changed our lives for the better. It changed the course of all of our lives. So negative experiences, we also asked parents, had they had negative experiences? And I think the most common experiences that parents discussed were relating to discrimination based on their family type, their gender, and then intersectionality, as we have discussed, if they belong to another group, whether it be it LGBTQI or they have a disability, they really felt that the way those different groups that interacted affected them when they're interacting with public services. So sorry, I skipped forward there. I'll just go back. So some quotes again here from parents. You're assumed to have no education and all that's sent to you is low paid jobs. And add being a migrant, it's even worse. A parent described how they were some staff, when their son was in ICU, weren't happy for them to have a family member with them because wasn't the child's parent. So you see there where one parent families aren't fitting into the model that's exists there. The last quote, the woman I was speaking to said it was my own fault, that if I didn't have my child, I could have a career. And this is a common theme coming up from parents. They describe being told that, things like you got yourself into this mess, this is your own fault. The reason that you can't access the services you want is because of you and your family type. So along with discrimination then, as I mentioned before, dignity, respect and privacy came out quite commonly. So parents discuss feeling like they weren't given the respect they deserved, they were treated with a lack of dignity, and they express feeling frustrated and disheartened by stereotypical assumptions and judgmental language, stigma, and being treated like they were being asked, that they were asking for charity rather than asking to have a public service that they were entitled to. A common theme was a lack of understanding of their family type and a difficulty in accessing services and information. Some parents felt that this related to their family type and that if they were, belonging to another group, they might not find it as difficult to access the services they need. They talked about having to chase services, having to make a complaint in order to be heard. And whilst parents didn't name their experiences as such, some of the experiences they described and their treatment does constitute harassment in that it violated their dignity or created an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive environment for them. And I think that that's clear in some of the quotes here today. And then also if you look if you read the guidelines, there's more quotes and more stories from parents covered there. So the first quote here from a parent, that they weren't treated with respect, they felt judged, the person was rude. And then another parent saying, it honestly feels like the minute you mention you're a lone parent, the stigma is attached to you and used to judge everything you do. The last quote there, a parent is describing how when they asked for an appointment that was flexible to suit their caring and work responsibilities, they were laughed at and told tough. So an example there where the caring responsibilities and additional challenges that one parent families face aren't being understood and aren't being empathized with and responded to. So the impact then of negative interactions. A key one, and in the same way with positive interactions, likewise, a negative interaction can put parents off accessing services in the future. They described feeling like they'd met a brick wall, that they'd nowhere to turn to. Other parents described feeling traumatized, having their self-worth undermined and being made feel less than other people. In some instances, parents described feeling that that their mental health and stress had increased, particularly stress. Parents reported that quite commonly. And some parents said that the interaction had an impact on their parenting and their ability to parent. So parents said that, their self-esteem were damaged, it makes life seem pointless, that they wouldn't feel confident in asking for support again, and that they're made feel lower and lesser and, going in a crisis and coming out feeling worse. Parents, a common theme again was feeling hurt and actually feeling, frustrated, but particularly like hurt by the interaction. And it's not something that parents walk away from and shake off. It's something that stays with them, feeling belittled and humiliated as if they're a lesser person. And this last quote, I think is really, well, I find it quite affecting. I felt I wasn't good enough as a parent for my child because that parent was describing how they weren't able to access the service that they need. So we asked parents what one change they would like to see, and a core change was training. So parents had lots of suggestions about training, things like training on equality and human rights, training on, you know, what it's like to be in a one-parent family and the positive aspects and celebrating one-parent families, training on domestic, gender and sexual-based violence, training on to challenge public sector workers and bodies unconscious biases. So to really dig down into what biases are there and to challenge those and make sure that applies to their work. Understanding and empathy, and that goes back to that bit of training about, you know, the lived experiences of one-parent families and what are the challenges and what are the circumstances and what are the different types and the diverse types of families. So understanding and empathy. Developing more inclusive services. So some parents had some logistical suggestions on how this could be achieved. So things like having appointment times that are outside of regular hours or are flexible, or reserving specific appointments or specific slots for people in one-parent families, using digital technology to have appointments, just to allow parents to you know, pick up kids from school or whatever it may be. Parents very strongly felt that they would like to have a say in the public services that they use, and that they felt the consultation with parents was really the way to go about this, and that they wanted to, where possible, participate in the services and how they were being delivered, and to really take an active approach. And they felt that this would be a way of, you know, unlocking that piece around empathy and understanding. So I'm just now going to talk briefly about the guidelines. So both guidelines were developed with the experiences that were shared with us from parents at the centre, and they informed every piece of the guidelines. So the first guideline is for parents, a guide to knowing your rights and recognising discrimination. So to give you an overview, it starts with an introduction and background, you know, looking at where we were and where we've come from. So the fact that, you know, mother and baby homes, Magdalene laundries, and, you know, this era of, you know, very strong stigma around one-parent families is not that long far back in our history. And then talking about where one-parent families are today, so that there's really rich and diverse family types, you know, they're not an homogenous group. But they do face specific challenges around, you know, high levels of poverty, high levels of deprivation. We go on then to talk about the research and to really centre parents' voices from the get-go and throughout. So the parents' voices are featured throughout the guidelines. We also use examples for parents. So things like, what does it look like to be discriminated against because of my gender? What does it look like to have discrimination because of family type? What does it look like to have positive action, and what, you know, what are the examples there? Also, we've looked at case law as well, and detailed, you know, some really strong case studies in parents' own voices from the research that highlight the difference that a negative experience can have for a family and the difference that a positive experience can have. And I think that's the one that Sinead quoted to earlier on. We then have a section on what are human rights and what does equality mean. So it's really just setting out the key principles around human rights and equality, followed by the legal framework. So we give an overview of international human rights framework, and then also the equality legislation within Ireland that's relevant to one-parent families, to really give them the information, I suppose, and the background that they need about their rights and equality. We then look at the public sector duty. We explain what it is and how it relates to families. And we also detail for parents what to do if they've been discriminated against and where they can find help. So the second guide then, a guide to delivering public services, is for people in frontline roles in the public sector, and also for in decision-making roles in public bodies. So the start of the guideline mirrors the parents' guideline quite closely, so I won't go through that, but just where it differs is around the public sector and equality and human rights duty section. So it talks about, I suppose, at an individual level, it talks about what to do, what to think of when you're working with parents. So things, again, inspired by the research and informed by the research, things like dignity and respect, family type, intersectionality. It details key terms and how to talk about people in one-parent families, what kind of language to use, and I suppose what kind of language not to use. What to do if someone working in a public body witnesses discrimination against either a service user or a colleague based on their, based for whatever reason, but particularly if it's based around their family or civil status, and what action they can take. And then the next section is more looking at the organizational level. What can public bodies do to improve the experiences of one-parent families? And this is directly informed from the research with parents and lists some of the suggestions that they gave there. So for example, training for staff. We also cover consultation with one-parent families and how to go about it. What to do to make your public body a good place for one-parent families to work and to make an attractive place to employ one-parent families, and to maybe increase the number of one-parent families who are employed in your public body. And then obviously key and really important is the recommendation to carry out an equality and human rights impact assessment. So some reflections then on the research and the project and the feedback from parents. I think the power of being heard was key. It was very clear when parents talked about the difference between negative and positive interactions, the power that had in terms of their mental health, their family circumstances, in terms of their ability to parent, and most importantly, and I think key, in terms of their willingness to engage in future with public services. I would also say, as a reflection of taking part in the research, parents' feedback to us was that they really valued being listened to, and in particular, I found during the focus groups, parents might not necessarily readily think of themselves having been discriminated against, but when they heard other parents' stories, it resonated with them, and they found real value in that sharing of stories amongst similar families, parents from similar family types. I think that we had some really good feedback from parents, particularly who took part in the Rights Holders Steering Group, who reported that they went away and were able to then talk about their rights and talk about equality in their interactions with public services, and it gave them confidence to know that the standards that they should be looking for when they engage with the public service, and the kind of treatment that they shouldn't be accepting. So another reflection, I suppose, and what really came out very strongly from parents, was that one-parent families are unique. They're not a homogenous group. There's not a one size fits all that really suits every family. You have families who are sharing parenting, you have families, where parents are parenting alone. They're very diverse group, and they're not a small group. They're a large section of society. They're not, some small marginalized group. They are very big, and they don't fit into the model of a two-parent family that is often the default with public services. And that was a really key, I suppose, feedback from parents that came through. And then finally, then, just to touch on, because I know Karen's going to speak about this a bit more, is the role of policy. The focus of the research wasn't around policy, it was around public experience of using public services. But parents did raise policy inequalities with us, and we are aware of them through our work. And, what is the role between public services being delivered, and if there are policies that are being implemented, and those public services are delivering upon policies where there's an element of inequality in them, how does that affect the public service, and how do they interact? And I suppose that's just a question that arose from the research, and something that I know Karen's going to talk a little bit about later. So thank you very much. I will stop sharing now, and hopefully have some questions later on.
Niamh, thank you very, very much for that. on an optimistic note in terms of where we want to get to, I was very struck by what you talk about, the power of positive experience and the fact that can have real and tangible outcomes for people availing of services. And it also strikes me as also that it must be far more fulfilling for the person delivering a service if in fact they can deliver that positive outcome. I mean, I know from my own experience as a practicing solicitor, I have many clients who are in very difficult circumstances. They don't always have ideal outcomes, but I mean, what I do find is if you speak honestly to people, give them clear advice and are genuine with them, that in and of itself is a benefit to those individuals, those clients for me, even if, as I say, they don't always have ideal outcomes or if they're going through difficult experiences. So I think that optimistic where we can get to, I think is really important to focus on. Thank you for that. Just to say, sorry, I think there may be a difficulty in terms of displaying the agenda on screen. So just to say in terms of that, I think it is on the Eventbrite and it's on the website, but we can't actually display the agenda on the screen. So just to say, just in terms of housekeeping, we have 3 more speakers coming up. Sid, lone parent, is going to be the next up. Then we have the CEO of One Family, Karen Kiernan, and then we have Tom Ward from the Court Service. Those next 3 speakers are going to be speaking roughly between now and 12:30, and then we will have a Q&A session for 15 minutes, and we'll conclude at about 12:45. We're running slightly behind, but I'm sure we'll catch up without putting pressure on any of our next speakers. So obviously, in terms of, I mean, optimism, positivity is great, but obviously the focus as well is addressing negative experiences, and I think our next speaker is Sid, who is a lone parent and is going to speak about her experiences, and really, look, I leave it to Sid to describe that rather than me say any more. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm Sid, lone parent of 3 children ranging between 6 and 24 years of age. As you can see, I had a short break in between. So, as you can also hear, due to my accent, I'm a migrant as well. So I came to this country 10 years ago. My background is I am a trained teacher back home in Germany. I was involved with the equivalent of One Family in Germany and served on their board. So I have a bit of experience in between 2 countries and how they addressed issues surrounding the behavior in with engaging with public service bodies, right? So I became a lone parent 6 years ago now in July, and I found it very stressful to even understand where to go from there. That was not like a straightforward path. I then went to the Department of Social Protection after having filled out all the maternity papers, which was in itself not so easy. My first engagement there was very negative, because I ended up at a general booth as things are, and I was sent away straight away saying I needed an appointment that I didn't know. When I said, but this is quite urgent, I was told anything ranging from, then why don't you go home? When I said my home was actually in Ireland, the person didn't take it very well when I insisted on that. The second appointment with the actual officer, an account manager in the One Parent Family section of my of that office, was very positive though. And I think that just displays that there is often a lack of training between different people in the same department. So the actual people working in the One Family Parent section were obviously quite aware of how to talk to people, and he took his time and he took my background, and he was very ready to help as much as he could straight away. I thought that was a very positive engagement, and until I think only 3 months later, only 3 months after this engagement, I had a call to come into a welfare inspector. I didn't think anything of it. I took my papers, I went there. From my point of view, I had nothing to hide. That's not how this appointment went. So as many of you know that have engaged with these services, you have to bring a range of papers, starting from your banking statements to, like, it's a fine comb through your situation, right? And that inspector took it upon herself to question me about my expenses, to really insisting that if I am really a lone parent, I did not quite understand that question because I was living alone. And she insisted that she would know that I was lying to her. When I said, well, I'm not lying, she said, I can come to your house any given time. At that point, I felt a little bit angry. So I said in a kind of like not my finest moment, but I said in a quite passive aggressive tone, well, I make you a cup of tea. Needless to say, she never showed at my house, but this engagement left me very disillusioned about the service, because there was no straight line in that department. So as I said, the actual account manager was a lovely man, really engaged with the process and trying to help and telling me precisely what he needed to make the process smooth, while the inspector that obviously deals with a range of situations definitely was on the side of finding out if I was cheating the system. That didn't feel great. So my own situation was I wanted to go back to work as soon as possible again, which was not possible due to the lack of childcare, which we all know is an issue in this country. And I got an invitation by the same department to attend a local job and employment fair. I thought, great, this is a good idea, I'm going there. But there was nothing there that would have fit my situation. Like everything that was presented at this fair was a range of like training you into really low paid jobs. The part of the childcare section was, oh, here's a leaflet, right? So I booked an appointment with the actual, I don't know what they call this, but it was kind of like a person dealing with going back to work and career development. I went in, I brought my papers, I described my work experience, and she looked me in the eye and said, I cannot do anything for you. There is nothing we can train you in. You have the highest level of university education. There was absolutely nothing. And I said, well, the only thing I really actually need help with is childcare. And the information was, again, here's our leaflet. Now, childcare, at least in my town, starts well after working hours. If you are lucky enough to find even a place in outside Dublin, Ireland, right? The engagement ever since has been that I decided to go self-employed. Due to my experience, I was able to do that, which is the only way that is like supporting me taking care of my child and picking him up from school and scheduling appointments, right? I'm also disabled, so I have certain appointments with the rheumatology department in 2.5 hours from my house. So I need to be able to work around them. That process has been difficult again because the regulations in Ireland are changing from one payment to another, right? If you are on a one-parent family payment, you can be self-employed, you get the same income disregard as other people, which is, you can correct me, but I think it's around about like 165 euros. That changes when you switch to the follow-up payment. The follow-up payment would be a job seekers transitional payment, and that has clearly stated that you cannot be self-employed for the income disregard. I have since founded a group of single self-employed parents, and the experience across board is that that is a huge issue, because a lot of people fall out of any government support when they decide to get self-employed. Now, you know that a lot of single parents, as myself and others, have no other choice than being self-employed. We face massive issues during the summer months with, especially, as I said, if you're outside of Dublin, with childcare. 2 months of summer holidays is a very long time to cover, and summer camps cost a lot of money. And the issue itself is that a lot of them fall out of government supports due to the lack of this income disregard, due to not being able to access a working family payment, because this is also only for employed people, and being precisely and consistently assumed to make way more money than we actually do, right? I had a call from another parent the other day who is in Dublin City Council, and her housing department assesses her rent as earning 500 euros every week if she earns it or not. Now, that woman has long COVID and is certainly not earning 500 euros, but is assumed to earn that. So her housing assistance payment has been slashed, literally slashed. When she asked for help with the department, they said she just needs to deregister from revenue and no longer be self-employed. These are just some of these experiences where you see there is an intricate internalized idea that lone parents are sort of uneducated. They certainly don't have any higher education, like many of us do. They only can work part-time. You somehow feel like that the uniqueness of our families is not regarded at any taken point, right? It is somehow this idea that stems from, I think, a long term of Irish history of fallen women, right? And that displays itself in a variety of public services, not in departments that regularly or singularly deal with single parents, but the surrounding departments. And you find that also their own system, even if you find someone very helpful, is designed like that. There is a box ticking idea of how these families look like. And if you're not ticking that precise box, then it becomes very difficult. That ranges from housing assistance payments, as I have elaborated, to education supports, to even what your children look like. Like, I was speaking to a housing department here in my county the other day, and the woman was baffled that I had a child in university. And that felt, not for myself, but for the general idea of what is thought these single parent families look like, that they don't have university children. I was really sad hearing that. Because you can see there is a kind of stigma still attached to people that is just not reflecting current society in general. If you want to get supports, people learn very quickly that they often need to find it outside of those systems. They're engaging with their TDs, local counselors, and need them to step in. That stepping in then has the idea of there needs to be a man to step in, right? Because you don't have that husband speaking for you. And so I had the same situation. I asked my local TD to accompany me to one of these meetings, and the discussion went completely different. The outcome was different, the way he was spoken to was different, and suddenly things were possible I got told were not possible. And I think if you're in a one-parent family, you already face a higher stress level of getting your appointments right and getting your work and family sorted. That having to employ a TD or a counselor every time you need something is really not something that should be happening. In general, I think this is just coming from a long term of Irish history. As I said, I was a single parent in Germany, employed with this, and if I look at policies around there, considering employment or even payments, a discrimination like, oh, from one payment to another, your employment status has to change, would be regarded as discriminating. And then there's a clear pathway, and if this policy is discriminating, it can be solved in that department. There's also usually in your Department of Social Protection, if you have an account manager, he's the sole person you're dealing with, unless there would be any like, you know, regards of that there's fraud involved or anything, but they take care of your housing payments, they take care of your career progress. They are there to advise you of your rights and duties. And so that feels way less frazzled out as it does in Ireland. And you can be assured that this person is trained on how to deal with single parents and how to not discriminate against them. I think we have a long way to go. Thank you very much for letting me participate in that research. And I'm really glad that One Family is available for single parents. They helped me in the past, even if it was just a phone call, where someone sits on the other line who is actually listening. So thank you very much.
Sid, thank you so much for that. I mean, I think that's really the most important thing that we have to hear today is the real life experiences of people and your experience of sort of random in terms of the service you get. It's interesting to see your different perspective coming from an experience of other different systems and the Irish system, and how the Irish system maybe is still informed by our last 100 years of history, our reliance on TDs and counsellors to get things done, rather than simply saying, look, we treat everybody equal that comes through the door. And also your experience of the preconceptions of people, and also I think and issues of power imbalance and people coming into the services who are desperate for services. And really have no power in terms of the persons they're dealing with. I think just on that, I think it's worth reading a quote we got in there from Valerie Marr, and when she says that lone parents often fear interaction with state services. They describe dreading getting that brown envelope with the harp in the post, as it triggers a potential negative interaction with government department or threatens their only source of income and other supports. This significant power differential needs to be acknowledged and respected, and training of public servants is essential to support them in this, which I think probably Sid, you would probably entirely agree with those sentiments. Thank you so much for that. We're now going to move on to our next speaker, who is CEO of One Family, known, I'm sure, to pretty much everybody who's on this call, and she's going to speak about human rights in the one parent families policies perspective.
Thanks, Donna, and many thanks to everyone else who has spoken today, and in particular Sid and Niamh, who were able to describe some of the voices and real life experiences of the rights holders who participated in the research. And of course, many of these issues that parents are raising are policy issues. People have these challenges because there are real legal, social and policy differences, problems and discrimination. So I just want to pull out some of these and to start with some of the kind of very high level contextual issues. And one of this is, of course, poverty. We know that one parent families, some of the poorer outcomes they face them because they're in higher levels of poverty than they need to be. This week is Child Poverty Week. We know that fuel and cost of living are escalating and the budget's around the corner. So I just want to mention a couple of actions that we would strongly recommend to try and address the unnecessary and escalating rate of poverty in one-parent families. And one is that we need an interdepartmental approach to this. We would like a high-level civil servant committee pulled from different departments who are focused on the poverty levels in one-parent families and who are working together to reduce it, and who report to a government subcommittee. And another really important issue is child poverty, and we need a national child poverty action plan, and we need a dedicated resourced office in a government department to drive its implementation, because most poor children, unfortunately, in Ireland live in one-parent families. So they are kind of the bedrock for a lot of the other challenges that people are facing. And what has come up really strongly from previous speakers is the attitude, the training, and the, in some ways, the personality of individual staff who are working in customer-facing public bodies. And then intersecting with that is the structure of those bodies and how it has been built. And both of these things need to be addressed, because it has been a major concern of ours is around unconscious bias of people who are delivering public services. And I have been very recently in a meeting with people who are responsible for lone parents, who are not aware that how they speak about parents, in my opinion, is actually biased. They can't see that themselves. So this stuff can be very subtle, but it can scream at parents who are in the situation and who are on the receiving end. And the other linked issue is that many parents in the research reported finding it very hard to get accurate information, and they sometimes felt that they knew more than the professional sitting across the counter from them. And there's also issues with accessing staff in public bodies. So we know that a lot of government departments are really having difficulty getting qualified in recruiting and retaining good staff. But this is actually a challenge at the moment for all businesses that needs to be addressed. So customers need to be seen and treated as valuable, whether they're wealthy shoppers in Grafton Street or whether they are claiming a social welfare payment. We all have to ensure that our staff are appropriately trained to be able to deliver the appropriate service. So from the research, there are about 30 specific policy recommendations, and I'm just going to pull out some of those today to highlight with you. And I want to start with education related issues. And just to say that we could not find a published public sector duty plan for either the Department of Education or the Department of Further and Higher Education. So there's a number of technical issues relating to supports for one-parent families who are accessing education and training, which works against them. So for parents who move from the job seekers transition payment onto the job seekers allowance payment, they are not allowed to stay on SUSI, which is the kind of universal support for students. They have to go onto the back to education allowance, which really disadvantages them. And research from Maynooth has found this. So we need that to be changed, and we need people to be able to stay on SUSI at least until their youngest child has completed second level education. Because what is the point in making it harder for people? There's also a very complex issue about housing payments, because again, if you're on the one-parent family payment or JST and you're on rent supplement, you cannot get SUSI, but you can if you're on other types of housing support. So this again makes no sense that the ability to access and stay in education is somehow linked to your housing tenure. We have repeatedly raised this ourselves and other organisations with various ministers, but to no avail, and it is very frustrating. SUSI is also only available for full-time in-person courses, which makes no sense given the past few years we've all lived through, and given the caring responsibilities for lone parents, which Sid has just spoken about. So it also needs to be available for part-time and blended learning courses. All of these things, if they were fixed, would actually support government policy of educating and supporting people who are on social welfare into education and work. In 2021, there was a good news story from Minister Heather Humphreys, because she changed the rules for the disability allowance to exempt PhD stipends on the basis that it was unfair and a disadvantage to a group of people with disabilities who already face considerable barriers in accessing education. But the same means test remains for one-parent families, which we find inexplicable. We know that these two groups are the most likely to be living in poverty and to be living in jobless households. So we are hoping that this will get changed and there will be parity here. And we have brought this to the minister's attention. Another really positive government policy was the introduction and then the gradual extension of parents' leave as required by EU legislation. But in Ireland, children of single parents only get half of this leave with their parents than children in two-parent families do. So we've continuously raised this with ministers and civil servants in several departments, but to no avail. This was introduced as a gender equality policy to promote fathers taking leave in the first year of their babies' lives, but has actually resulted in blatant discrimination against single parents and their babies, and we believe it urgently needs to be changed. So I want to move on to a couple of connected issues in relation to child benefit, our taxation system and shared parenting. Child benefit, of course, is a really important universal payment to parents and guardians for the cost of caring for their children. But in shared parenting families, it's only paid to the parent who has the majority custody. But where the custody is 50-50, the child benefit automatically goes to the mother, and there's no ability to switch or to share the payment. So there's inbuilt gender discrimination, and situations like this, we believe, should be decided on a case-by-case basis based on that particular family's custody agreement. But a connected issue is the single person child carer credit. It's a long name for not a great tax relief, the SPCCC, and it's linked to the child benefit payment. It was changed a number of years ago so that instead of both parents now getting it, only one can get it where people are sharing parenting. And we have found it again has disproportionately affected dads. We have found it practically impossible to get any communication on this at a policy level. And we believe that the current situation of it being linked to child benefit causes conflict between parents, which can inhibit good shared parenting, which has negative impacts for children. It also increases child poverty because the tax allowance is now not available to both parents, discriminates on the basis of gender, and so it urgently needs to change. Finally, in this area, budget 22, there was the announcement of a €50 per person increase to the single person and married couple tax credits, but there was no similar increase to the SPCCC. So clearly people parenting alone and sharing parenting of their children are not being considered in an equal way to other people in our tax code. So moving on to social welfare, as you can imagine, and as we've heard from Sid, it came up quite a lot in the research, as so many one-parent families rely on state assistance due to the high levels of poverty they experience. And this is very sensitive. It can be sensitive and challenging for many people. Financial supports from the state, and it's also made more difficult when some payments just seem to exclude or discriminate against them without it being logical. It's also worth noting that the Department of Social Protection does not yet have a published public sector duty plan available. So one of the issues that we have been looking for, along with colleagues and other organisations, is that the living alone allowance and the home benefits package and telephone allowance should also be paid to one parent families. At the moment, it's paid to households on a single long-term social protection payment, because so much of a one social welfare income would go on running that household, but it's not available to lone parents. The only additional payment parents will get is a QCI, qualified child increase, which is very low. It's inadequate to meet the needs many children have, never mind the additional costs of running the house. So we believe that that is unfair. For parents in receipt of the working family payment, everyone has to work 19 hours a week, but lone parents have to work the same number of hours per week as a two-parent family who can do it between them. Again, we think this is unfair, makes no sense in terms of supporting employability of lone parents. And we would like to see that reduced to 15 hours a week to help one-parent families work as much as possible and maximise their earnings. And the same issue that Sid outlined is that there is a difference between self-employed and PRSI workers in terms of the job seekers transitional payment, which again makes no sense to us, but is moving people out of the workplace for no good reason. Housing, as we know, is a massive issue of stress. There's huge shortage and there's inequality because most families living in emergency and homeless accommodation are single mothers with one or two children. Sinead referenced their IREX research earlier on this. And also what's not counted and is therefore overlooked is the proportion of fathers who are counted as single adults, but who actually may be sharing parenting of their children. And these dads need access to safe, suitable accommodation to care for their children. And this also means they need adequate emergency accommodation and access to social housing. So the recommendation on this is that fathers who shared parenting should be able to access family housing supports, whether it's an emergency accommodation or HAP, the housing assistance payment, or social housing, because we're actually aware in one family of cases where fathers have been discriminated against solely because of their gender. And we recognise the good work IRIC has done in this area for both mothers and fathers in the area of housing. There are complexities and inequalities as well in housing, where married parents have separated and jointly own a family home. Just to say briefly, what we have seen coming through the research is that they may both be excluded from most housing support schemes, from social housing and from the HAP. There are no supports anymore from social protection for people with mortgages, and we anticipate a deluge of older separated people who will be homeless, as will their young adult children in the future. And we believe we need to plan for this now with a family homelessness strategy to help people maintain the value they've built up in their homes and to avoid becoming homeless and therefore cost the state more, never mind the distress to these families, which is unnecessary. So this is just a very quick overview of some of the most blatant discriminatory laws, policies and services as found through the research, as well as contextualising those in the bigger issues of poverty and then the public sector staff and information. I recognise that some departments do actively engage and listen to us in relation to issues that are unfair and discriminatory, and sometimes there are positive changes, such as the back to school clothing and footwear allowance last year, which was equivalised for one parent families. But these fixes, I suppose, are far fewer than they should be. And so we look forward to more engagement and solution to these problems, that we don't continue to leave people behind, and support ongoing state discrimination and inequality impacting one parent families who are already heavily burdened. Thank you.
Karen, thanks very much for that, and thank you for picking up time there. We're slightly running over, so as a consequence of that, I'm going to move straight on and bring in Tom Ward, who's our final speaker. Tom is Assistant Secretary of the Court Service of Ireland, and he's going to discuss their experience in terms of developing a public sector duty plan. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks very much, Donna. If it's okay with everybody, I have a short presentation to talk through the main points I'm going to make. So I'm going to put it up now. Hopefully everybody will be able to see this okay. Just going through. Is that okay with everybody? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we can see that, Tom.
Great, thanks. Okay. Okay, so just a very brief overview of how we went about implementing the public sector duty in the court service. As Donna said, I'm in charge of the Superior Courts Directorate, which encompasses the Supreme Court, Court of Appeal and the High Court. Before that, I was working with our CEO, Angela, in her office. And while I was there, took the initiative to lead the process about the development of the public sector duty for us, but also continued it on once I was appointed to the new role, given its importance to the organisation. So my presentation this afternoon will talk about why we did it, how we went about it, what did we learn, and what are we going to do next. So just to clarify what our role is, so this is an extract from Section 5 of the Court Service Act 1998. And as you can see, our functions are to manage the courts, provide support services to the judges, provide information on the court system to the public, provide, manage and maintain court buildings, and provide facilities for users of all the courts. So we're not the judges. The judges are a different group of people, but our role is to make sure that the courts that are making decisions in relation to the people on the call, and many people that are not on the call, run as smoothly as possible, but also enhance the information that's available to people who come and use our service. And it's interesting listening to Karen and Sid's contributions beforehand, the implications for all public services and the impact on our citizens of public services that don't quite join all the dots in this space. So this is certainly the direction of travel we want to fulfill. So why did we did it? Well, Sinead, no doubt, has confirmed already. We had a statutory obligation to do it under the 2014 Act, but it also was consistent with a number of different initiatives that are of importance to us. I suppose, first of all, because we are a customer service organisation, this tied in nicely with our aspirations to improving the quality of the service we deliver to a diverse group of service users. And indeed, that's a really important point to make. You know, at some stage in a person's lives, they have an occasion to deal with the court service, whether it's on family law matters, whether it's in civil matters, or indeed sometimes whether it's applying for probate on behalf of a deceased loved one as well too. So we acknowledge and recognise that responsibility. We're also in the middle of an ambitious long-term programme to modernise our operations. It's interesting reflecting on our experience during the pandemic, where restrictions were put on people's ability to travel, their ability to drop into our court's offices, and also their ability to attend court. And I suppose there's quite a few learnings out of that, including a pent-up desire for people to do their business online, but that also when they're attending court, that they would attend court for a specific time that would be scheduled, and that and that there was a strong likelihood of the matters going ahead at the time in question. So all of this stuff is consistent with our modernisation programme. We also wanted to make the organisation a more inclusive environment for our staff. Like many organisations, we're recruiting people from a variety of different backgrounds and experiences. And we want to send out the message that we are committed as a good employer to making it a more inclusive environment too. Lastly, it's an opportunity to innovate. And I think this was the key learning for us, the need to see the way we do our business through the lens of equality and diversity, and making sure that when we're making decisions around the way we do things into the future, that we have that equality and diversity lens on, that we take account of people's human rights when attempting to carry out, bring about process improvements. So how do we go about it? Well, it required a sustained effort during 2020 and into 2021. And we had a committed group of volunteers from right across the organisation meet every Friday morning for a good hour, where we debated exactly what all of this meant. And that took quite a while too, because very often where you get a word of an edict from central government or wherever, there's a tendency to box tick, and clearly this wasn't appropriate in this instance. So we spent a good bit of time working out, well, what is this all about? And we came to some conclusions fairly quickly. First of all, it had to be meaningful, not only for our customers, but also for the staff that were involved in it, because people would see through this fairly quickly if it wasn't meaningful. It had to be achievable. Okay, so any of you who have the opportunity to look at our initial plan, I would say from the off that all of the targets that we've set are achievable and not aspirational, I suppose. And this was important from the point of view of giving the process some momentum. It needs to become part of our culture. And really, we recognized fairly early on that this was about effecting long-term change. This was not something you do once and forget about it. This was something that really had to change the way we did our business, and I suppose be front and center of any improvements that we're looking to introduce. So in this regard, we had a very important input from Una Doyle. Una was the head of the same process in the probation service. The probation service, as Sinead will confirm, were one of the pilot public sector organisations who went first in this area as well too. And Una's experience, I suppose, enabled us move on and bring about some effective change. So what did we learn as we were going to go? Well, first of all, we need to capture what we're already doing. And I suppose a lot of people who we deal with won't be aware of what coming to court entails, or what we're about. So we're doing a lot of good things in this space already. So people attending court, particularly on the criminal side of the house, get interpretation facilities for people with sign language and other disabilities, and the whole issue of access to courtrooms, hearing loops, wheelchair accessibility, all of that sort of stuff was stuff that we were doing already, and we needed to remind the people that come and deal with our service about that availability. We also need to tease out the issues that are not at first glance human rights and equality issues. So we were probably a little bit naive in thinking about modernization and, I suppose, an approach to e-filing that surely everybody would be in favor of this, but clearly, as all of you on the call will be aware, things like access to information technology facilities, broadband, literacy, all that sort of stuff plays to the heart of our ability to provide services that take account of people's human rights. So that is going to be part of our modernisation programme, and thinking about how do we make sure that where we're offering cutting edge services like electronic filing, that they actually improve rather than disimprove the situation. We also needed to identify some activities that might constitute quick wins, but will enable people get behind the whole theme. So an example would be that we'd set ourselves a target for the provision of fair trade products in our canteen facilities around the estate. But overall, I suppose there was an acknowledgement, while there's a lot to be done, some of those will be encompassed within our strategic plans and our strategic priorities, but others will require more long-term activity and will be more challenging. So I've given the example there of the recruitment issue. Not too many people with different backgrounds are attracted to work in the civil service more generally. So we need to look at how we incentivize people from different ethnic backgrounds, for instance, to come and work in the courts and other places. Likewise, issues around recording information about ethnicity and our challenges around GDPR, where we as a court service don't need to record people's ethnicity. It doesn't make a difference to the provision of service, but is hugely of interest to researchers and commentators and others outside of the organization. So how do we balance those conflicting challenges there as well? So what are we going to do next? Well, the initial group that met to develop the plan merged with a wider group of senior managers. We've catchily called ourselves Inclusion, and as a result of doing that, there's a bigger group of people with wider spans of control interested in working in this area, and as well as getting more momentum behind it as well. We would accept and acknowledge that our initial assessment document is a good first step, but that we have a long way to go. And we believe it's the original living document, in that people will go beyond what's in it and be encouraged to do so. I'll be sticking with this. It's an important thing for me personally, but also I'll be sponsoring it with our senior management team and keep making sure that it sustains the momentum. But I suppose lastly, both me and the members of the group will continue to sell the message of seeing the work we do through the human rights and equality lens that stems not only in relation to modernisation initiatives, but also on a frontline basis, and what happens in public counters up and down the country, and thinking about the way we come across to our customers as well when they come in to get service. So that's really it for me this afternoon. If anybody is interested in having a look at our report, it's on courts.ie. I don't expect anybody to drop it down, but it's in our publication section if you want to find it right at the very end. That's my email address there. So that's it, guys. Thanks very much.
Tom, sorry, you might just take that off the screen there, Tom, if you could.
I'll do my best. Yeah.
Yeah, no, many thanks for that, Tom. I mean, I think that the issue about human rights approach being part of your culture is really what's essential. I mean, Karen talked earlier on about unconscious bias, and really what we want is both conscious and unconscious human rights approach for people who are providing services to the public and to individuals. And I mean, I think that's a job of work, but you have to start somewhere, I suppose. Now, thanks for that, Tom. So I think we have about 10 minutes left, so we might have time for just a couple of questions. First question I have here is, I think probably best for Sinead. And the question is, are there any plans to expand the remit of the public sector duty to other organizations, or to develop a similar duty for the private sector? And do you think that there will merit in such an expansion? Sinead.
Thanks, Donna, and thanks to everybody. Really, really fascinating to hear all the contributions today. And yeah, I mean, certainly SIDS is just so powerful, and really heartening to hear your commitment, Tom, in terms of the public sector duty. And what I found actually really shone through, as has from so many organizations who've done it properly, is once you start to do it in that committed way, once you have the kind of extended conversation, you do start to see that it is a long-term project, that it is something that you are going to have to commit to, that can really transform the organization to your benefit. So really wonderful to hear that. In terms of the remit, there are no plans as it is for an extension of the public sector duty. One thing to point out that's important that people might not be aware of is that through procurement, it does extend to any organisation who is contracted essentially in that way by, and we have more details of that on our website, by a public sector body. In terms of the private sector, I think that would be of huge value, and it's something we are looking at actively at the moment under the banner of the equality law review that's underway, the one that I mentioned in my talk from Minister O'Gorman. So in so many ways, we expect and we aspire for the public sector to be the role model in terms of workplaces, in terms of those boundaries. I came from the public sector or the private sector myself, so I'm very well aware that initiatives that fall under the banner of corporate social responsibility, or I think more recently now it's ESG is the acronym that's banded about, they're self-regulated, they're self-serving, I would say, in some instances. Not that that's always a bad thing, but they are by no means regulated or enforced. So for me, if you are expecting corporate entities to have any movement in this area, it does have to be through regulation or enforcement. And I think the public sector duty or a positive obligation of some description would be really welcome. So it is something we will be pushing for, and I think it would be of huge value.
Great, thanks for that, Sinead. Just a quick question here for Niamh then. Niamh, what do you think are the main challenges in engaging parents in research of the kind undertaken?
Thanks, Donna. I think, well, one thing is, I suppose making sure that consultation is done in a way that is accessible to parents. And actually, we do have a list in the guidelines of for public bodies and how they can engage with parents. And I suppose these are some of the things that we would think about ourselves when we're engaging with parents, so that the engagement is accessible. It's on at either multiple times of the day to get, because there's, again, with this notion of it's not a homogenous group. For some parents, the morning is better. For some parents, evenings are better if you're looking for focus groups. I think being mindful as well at the moment that we're maybe coming out of this period, but certainly over the pandemic, parents had a little bit of consultation fatigue, and everyone was looking for their views on everything. So making sure that the engagement is meaningful to them, and that it's serving a purpose for them as parents. So some of the other things that we have in the guidelines for public bodies are around transparency, that engagement it's clear what the purpose is, and it's clear language, and that there is feedback given to parents where possible, and that they're kept in the loop. You know, certainly we would recommend, after doing this project and in our own work practices, of taking a model like a steering group or something that keeps engagement going throughout the project, so that it's not just a box ticking exercise at the start. And for public bodies, then the other two areas that we've asked them to look at is around power. And I know I saw a comment come in there from Valerie around power. You know, that people in one-parent families might feel uneasy about talking to the body that they are asking for public services from, or trying to access services from. So to be mindful of that, and how in your engagement, and make sure that, you know, parents don't feel threatened by taking part. And the final area then is just openness. I think it's really important to be open when you're engaging with parents about, you know, they might not tell you exactly what you want to hear, and their experiences might not again conform to that notion that you have about them. So being open to that kind of diverse feedback that you might get.
Thanks for that, Niamh. I think just maybe one final question, which just direct to Sid. And I think it's kind of a pertinent question, really, in terms of, I mean, the question is about whether or not, if Sid, you would think that having the one family guidelines would make a difference for someone in your experience. But I suppose the other part of that question, the flip side of the downside, would be, you know, do you have to go into meetings with individuals and start pointing to guidelines and saying you must follow the guidelines, as opposed to there being a culture where the guidelines are being followed automatically and intrinsically?
In fairness, guidelines are only as good as you can actually implement them or point to them, as you just said. So I think going forward, these type of guidelines would need to be like implemented in the specific departments that are dealing with single parents. I would not like to go into a meeting with my little handbook saying, look, you know, I've done that practically, because there are guidelines for certain things. And, you know, you're always like in a kind of, I think as Niamh pointed out, also threatening situation if you talk to a department that holds at least one or the only income you have. So I think the ball goes into another corner, and the corner is not that the single parent needs to bring the guideline, but that the service that single parent is dealing with is actually holding that ball and needs to hold it and make sure that these guidelines are implemented. So I think there needs to be a supervisory body there that makes sure, and that can be addressed, maybe even anonymously if something is happening, because not having something anonymously is, as I said, disengaging for many single parents. But to me, the guidelines are great, and I think it's good for parents to have them, but they're only as good as they are actually implemented.
Yes, I think that is very much the case. And I suppose it goes to, and maybe just a final comment from Karen, I suppose it goes to the really, you know, to what extent we can influence, and our lobbying and our policies can influence public bodies, which really is the core of that. I think is something that we discuss at board level all of the time. Really, what impact can we have? Certainly in terms of presenting a vision of the future, offering leadership and how change might come about. But you might just have a final comment on that, Karen. So you're muted there.
Sorry about that. You think I'd know at this stage. Look, I suppose for organisations like One Family, we're trying to be a go-between parents and public bodies, so that parents don't have to individually fight their cases, even though we often need to tell their stories to have people really understand. So it's very useful for us to be able to hear from rights holders and hear about their experience, but they shouldn't have to individually fight larger departments. It's our job to try and, based on the services and the research that we take, is to try and represent the changes that are needed and advocate for those to public sector bodies and encourage those bodies to do the right thing. I hope that answers your question, Donna.
Yeah, well, I think fundamentally that's where we have to get to, is the entire change of culture within public bodies. But that has to be driven ultimately internally, as I see it.
Yeah, and I suppose it can be difficult from the outside to understand how public bodies work and who are the levers and decision makers. That's a constant mystery to me. And you know, and to many of us who are working alongside civil servants is how things actually happen. So it is trying to find those internal champions can be difficult. And sometimes that may happen at ministerial level, or sometimes you'll have a good relationship with a particular civil servant who gets it, but they may move on. So it is a constant re-engagement with departments to try and help them. And of course, people don't like to be given out to. So it's always trying to show, here's what works really well, and more than with these guidelines, and here's the things that cause difficulties for people, and how can we all work together to make it better? Even though sometimes in your head you think, just do the right thing, you know, it's that none of it, all of us are human, and we all can feel defensive, and we all want to feel like we're doing the right thing, even if we're not. So it is a difficult thing, but I would see that more of us need to stand up for individuals and stand up collectively, because it's too hard for one parent or one child or one person on their own to have to do this.
That's a good way to finish it. So I think we've just come to the end of our time now. So I'd just like to really sincerely thank all of our speakers today: Sinéad Gibney, Tom Ward, Sid, our team from One Family, Niamh Kelly and Karen Kiernan, and also just a special thanks to Noel Sweeney from our communications team. Many thanks also to IREC for providing the funding for this research, this very valuable research, and the guidelines which have been produced. Obviously, a particular thanks to all of those who participated in the research, gave of their time, their experiences, and their insights, both in meetings, interviews, and through survey. I mean, we really appreciate that, because that is going to be the driver. That is the document, the information that we can use to go to public bodies to say, this is the experience of people. You may not even understand the negative experiences that people who engage with you are experiencing. Here is research to demonstrate those experiences. Here also is research to demonstrate that positive engagement has a hugely beneficial outcome and effect for people. So really, you know, it's that awareness, it's that education piece. Also, thank you for all attending today. Hopefully we can all go out and spread that message that we need to confront and educate people in terms of discrimination and unconscious bias and those issues, and the positive outcomes if we do so. Just finally to say that we will be emailing everyone in the coming weeks with a link to the recording of this event, so that hopefully it can be of use and benefit and resource into the future. Many thanks. Enjoy the rest of your day.